What if I told you there was once a king who owned more gold than entire nations, built a temple so magnificent that visitors fainted at its beauty, and was personally visited by God not once, but twice? This same king made silver as common as rocks, and his wisdom was legendary across continents. But here's the shocking twist. He also had 1,000 women in his life, 700 wives, and 300 concubinas, and this very blessing became his ultimate curse. How does divine favor turn into divine judgment? How does the wisest man in history make the most foolish decisions? Today, we uncover the incredible true story of King Solomon, where unlimited power, unmatched wisdom, and uncontrolled desires collide in the most dramatic biblical tale ever told. King David lay dying in his bed, his once mighty body now weak and cold. The greatest king Israel had ever known was about to pass from this world. But first, he had crucial words for his son. As recorded in 1 Kings chapter 2, David called Solomon to his side and spoke with the authority of a man who had walked with God for decades. "Be strong and show yourself a man," David told his son, "and keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn." The old king's voice grew more serious as he continued with specific instructions about enemies who still posed threats to the kingdom. David knew that Solomon would need to deal with Joab, the commander who had murdered innocent men, and with Shimei, who had cursed David during Absalom's rebellion. These weren't words of revenge, but of wisdom from a king who understood that mercy without justice could destroy a kingdom. But while David gave his final counsel, trouble was already brewing in the royal palace. Adonijah, Solomon's older half-brother, had decided he should be king instead. This handsome prince had been gathering supporters for months, hosting feasts and winning over important people like Joab the commander and Abiathar the priest. The palace was divided, with whispered conversations and secret meetings as two camps formed around the rival brothers. After the crisis of succession was settled and Solomon sat firmly on Israel's throne, the young king knew he faced an impossible task. How could anyone rule God's chosen people? The responsibility felt crushing, and Solomon understood he needed more than human wisdom to succeed. So he made a pilgrimage to Gibeon, the great high place where people came to worship the Lord. As 1 Kings chapter 3 tells us, this was no small journey. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar, showing his deep desire to honor God. That night at Gibeon, something extraordinary happened. As Solomon slept, God appeared to him in a dream that would change the course of history. The creator of the universe spoke directly to the young king with words that would make anyone's heart race. "Ask, what shall I give you?" Imagine that moment, the Almighty offering to grant you anything your heart desired. Most people would immediately think of wealth, long life, or power over their enemies. The temptation to ask for personal gain must have been overwhelming. But Solomon's response revealed something beautiful about his heart. "Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David, but I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in," Solomon prayed with genuine humility. "And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours?" This wasn't false modesty. This was a young man who truly grasped the weight of leadership and his own desperate need for divine help. God was so pleased with Solomon's selfless request that he not only granted wisdom, but promised riches and honor beyond any king before or after him. Soon, Solomon would face a test that proved to everyone that something supernatural had happened to their ruler. Two women came before the king with a problem that seemed impossible to solve. Both lived in the same house, both had given birth to sons around the same time, and both claimed that the living child was theirs. The first woman told her heartbreaking story as recorded in 1 Kings chapter 3. "This woman and I dwell in the same house, and I gave birth while she was in the house," she began. "Then it happened, the third day after I had given birth, that this woman also gave birth, and we were together. No one was with us in the house except the two of us." Her voice broke as she continued, "And this woman's son died in the night, because she lay on him. So she arose in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while your maidservant slept, and laid him at her breast, and laid her dead child at my breast." The second woman immediately protested, insisting that the living child was definitely hers, and the dead baby belonged to the first woman. Back and forth they argued, each absolutely certain she was telling the truth, each desperately wanting the living child. The court watched in fascination as the two mothers presented their cases. Here was a situation with no witnesses, no evidence, just two broken-hearted women and one precious living baby. Then Solomon did something that shocked everyone present. "Bring me a sword," the king commanded. When the weapon was placed before him, Solomon gave an order that made the entire court gasp in horror. "Divide the living child in two and give half to one and half to the other." The room fell deathly silent. Surely the wise king couldn't seriously be planning to kill an innocent baby to solve this dispute. But this was exactly the test Solomon had designed to reveal truth through the power of a mother's love. The woman who was the true mother immediately cried out in anguish, her heart unable to bear the thought of her child being harmed, even if it meant losing him forever. "Oh, my Lord, give her the living child, and by no means kill him," she pleaded desperately. The other woman, revealing her cold and selfish heart, responded with chilling words, "Let him be neither mine nor yours, but divide him." In that moment of truth, everyone in the courtroom knew who the real mother was. Solomon immediately declared, "Give the first woman the living child, and by no means kill him. She is his mother." The wisdom of this judgment was breathtaking. Without any evidence except human nature itself, the king had revealed the truth and saved an innocent life. Word of this incredible decision spread like wildfire throughout Israel, and the people realized their young king possessed wisdom that could only come from heaven itself. This famous judgment established Solomon's authority in a way that no military victory could have accomplished. The respect and reverence for his wisdom began to grow among all his subjects, from the highest nobles to the simplest farmers. People understood that their king could see into human hearts and discern truth in ways that seemed almost miraculous. This wasn't just clever thinking. This was divine insight that set Solomon apart from every other ruler on earth. But Solomon knew that wisdom alone wouldn't be enough to secure his kingdom permanently. There were still dangerous people who had opposed his rule and could threaten Israel's stability in the future. As 1 Kings chapter 2 records, he systematically dealt with those who posed risks to his reign, including his half-brother Adonijah, who continued to plot for the throne even after David's death. With his throne secure, Solomon turned his brilliant mind to creating something no king of Israel had ever attempted before, a government system that could efficiently manage an entire kingdom. He understood that ruling from Jerusalem alone wasn't sufficient for a nation that was growing larger and more complex every day. The old tribal system that had worked for smaller populations was no longer adequate for the prosperous, expanding kingdom Israel was becoming. Solomon's solution was revolutionary. As described in 1 Kings chapter 4, he divided Israel into 12 administrative districts, each one carefully designed and each responsible for providing food and supplies for the royal household for 1 month of the year. This wasn't arbitrary division. Each district was organized to be roughly equal in resources and population, ensuring fairness and efficiency throughout the kingdom. The king appointed 12 officers to govern these districts, and their names are recorded in scripture: Ben-Hur in the mountains of Ephraim, Ben-Decker in Makaz and Shalbim, Ben-Hesed in Aruboth, and 9 others, each carefully chosen for their ability and loyalty. These weren't just tax collectors. They were regional governors responsible for maintaining order, ensuring justice, and organizing the resources their districts would contribute to the kingdom's prosperity. This system was brilliant in its simplicity and effectiveness. Instead of the chaos and confusion that had often marked Israel's earlier history, with different tribes doing whatever they wanted, Solomon created order and efficiency that made the entire kingdom stronger. Each district knew exactly what was expected of them, and each had leadership that answered directly to the king in Jerusalem. The administrative system Solomon created allowed him to build military strength unlike anything Israel had ever possessed. As 1 Kings chapter 4 describes, Solomon had 40,000 stalls for his horses and chariots, and 12,000 horsemen stationed throughout the kingdom. This wasn't just about having a big army. It was about creating the kind of military power that would make other nations think twice before attacking Israel. But Solomon was incredibly smart about how he used this military strength. Instead of constantly fighting wars like his father David had been forced to do, Solomon preferred to make alliances and treaties that would prevent wars from happening in the first place. He built fortified cities in strategic locations throughout his kingdom, not just to prepare for war, but to demonstrate to potential enemies that Israel was now too powerful and well-organized to attack successfully. One of Solomon's most important strategic moves was his marriage alliance with Egypt. As 1 Kings chapter 3 mentions, Solomon married Pharaoh's daughter, bringing her to live in the city of David until he could build a proper palace for her. This wasn't just a personal relationship. It was a diplomatic masterstroke that secured Israel's southern border and opened up incredible new possibilities for trade and cooperation with the most powerful nation in Africa. The marriage to Pharaoh's daughter sent a clear message to the entire ancient world. Israel was no longer a small, struggling kingdom that could be bullied or ignored. Now even mighty Egypt wanted to be Israel's ally rather than their enemy. This alliance brought peace to Israel's borders and respect from nations far and wide, showing that Solomon's wisdom extended far beyond domestic affairs into the complex world of international diplomacy. The peace and stability that Solomon's wisdom had created throughout Israel and beyond its borders allowed something remarkable to happen. The kingdom became incredibly wealthy. Trade routes that had been dangerous during the constant wars of David's reign were now safe for merchants to travel. Money flowed into the royal treasury from taxes, tribute payments from other nations, and profits from the expanding trade networks that connected Israel to distant lands. As 1 Kings chapter 4 beautifully describes the prosperity of this golden age, Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea in multitude, eating and drinking and rejoicing. This wasn't just the royal court living in luxury while common people suffered. This was genuine prosperity reaching throughout the entire kingdom. The Bible tells us that the kingdom's secure borders stretched from Dan to Beersheba, meaning from the far north to the deep south, and everyone lived in safety. The symbol of this incredible peace and prosperity was that every person could sit under his vine and his fig tree without fear of attack or invasion. This phrase painted a picture of agricultural abundance and personal security that would have seemed like an impossible dream during the chaotic years before Solomon's reign. People could plant crops knowing they would be able to harvest them, build homes knowing they wouldn't be destroyed by war, and raise children knowing they would grow up in safety. Kings and rulers from distant nations began sending ambassadors to Jerusalem, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to establish good relationships with this obviously blessed kingdom. They brought gifts and tribute payments, recognizing that Solomon's Israel had become a major power that deserved respect and careful diplomacy rather than hostility or indifference. With peace established throughout his kingdom and prosperity flowing to all his people, Solomon's God-given wisdom began to express itself in ways that would make his name famous for thousands of years to come. As 1 Kings chapter 4 records, he spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. These weren't just clever sayings or entertaining songs, they were profound insights into life, human nature, and God's ways that people could use to live wiser, better, more successful lives. Solomon's incredible knowledge wasn't limited to spiritual or philosophical matters either. The Bible tells us that he spoke of trees, from the cedar tree of Lebanon, even to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. He spoke also of animals, of birds, of creeping things, and of fish. This king was a scientist, a naturalist, a philosopher, and a poet, all combined into one amazing person. His mind, sharpened and expanded by God's supernatural gift of wisdom, explored every aspect of creation with curiosity and understanding that amazed everyone who heard him speak. Word of Solomon's extraordinary knowledge and wisdom spread to the most distant lands, and people began making long, difficult journeys just to hear him teach and answer their most challenging questions. Kings sent their wisest advisors and scholars to Jerusalem to learn from Solomon and bring back reports of what they had discovered. Israel's capital city was transformed from a regional center into something like a great university where the smartest people in the known world gathered to exchange ideas and learn from each other. The young king, who had humbly asked God for wisdom to govern his people, had become the intellectual and cultural center of the entire ancient world, drawing visitors and students from every nation under heaven. Solomon had been king for 4 years when he began to understand the most important task of his entire reign. This wasn't about building more cities or conquering more enemies. This was about fulfilling a promise God had made to his father David. As recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 7, when David had wanted to build a house for the Lord, God had told him through Nathan the prophet, "When your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." Now Solomon realized that he was the son God had been talking about. The temple wasn't just going to be another building, it would be the place where God would meet with his people, where sacrifices would be offered, and where the presence of the Almighty would dwell among the tribes of Israel. This was a calling that went far beyond anything any human king had ever been asked to do. Solomon was going to build a house for the creator of the universe. The weight of this responsibility was enormous. How do you build something worthy of God? How do you create a structure that could honor the one who made the heavens and the earth? Solomon understood that this temple would become the center of Israel's spiritual life for generations to come. Every major festival, every important sacrifice, every moment when the people needed to seek God's face would happen at this sacred place. The temple wouldn't just be Solomon's greatest achievement, it would be the heart of Israel's relationship with their Creator. As 1 Chronicles chapter 28 records, David had already received detailed plans for the temple directly from God. "All this," David told Solomon, "the Lord made me understand in writing by his hand upon me." All the works of these plans, these weren't human architectural drawings. These were divine blueprints that showed exactly how God wanted his house to be built. Solomon's job was to take these sacred plans and turn them into reality. Solomon knew he couldn't build the temple using only Israel's resources. The finest materials in the world came from other lands, and no one was better at working with cedar wood than the craftsmen of Lebanon. So Solomon reached out to King Hiram of Tyre, a man who had been David's friend and ally for many years. This would be one of the most important diplomatic relationships in Solomon's entire reign. As 1 Kings chapter 5 tells us, Solomon sent messengers to Hiram with a proposal that would benefit both kingdoms. You know how my father David could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the wars which were fought against him on every side. Until the Lord put his foes under the soles of his feet, Solomon explained. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor evil occurrence. And behold, I propose to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord spoke to my father David. Solomon's request was specific and generous. He asked Hiram to command his servants to cut cedar trees from Lebanon, promising that his own workers would help and that he would pay whatever wages Hiram set for the Lebanese workers. For you know there is none among us who has skill to cut timber like the Sidonians, Solomon admitted honestly, showing the kind of humility that makes good partnerships possible. King Hiram was thrilled when he received Solomon's message. The Bible records his response. Blessed be the Lord this day, for he has given David a wise son over this great people. Hiram agreed immediately to provide all the cedar and cypress wood Solomon needed. This wasn't just a business deal, it was the beginning of a friendship between two kingdoms that would last for decades. The terms they worked out were perfect for both nations. Hiram would provide the timber and skilled craftsmen, while Solomon would pay with wheat and oil, 20,000 cores of wheat and 20 cores of pressed oil every year. This trade agreement meant that Lebanon got food for their people, while Israel got the finest building materials in the world. Both kings understood that this partnership would make both of their kingdoms stronger and more prosperous. Building God's temple required the largest construction project anyone in Israel had ever imagined. Solomon knew he needed thousands of workers, and he organized them with the same systematic brilliance he had used to organize his kingdom's government. As 1 Kings chapter 5 describes, Solomon raised up a labor force of 30,000 men from all Israel. But he was wise about how he used them. Instead of forcing them to work constantly away from their homes and families, he sent them to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 men each month. So they would work 1 month in Lebanon and then spend 2 months at home. This rotating system showed Solomon's wisdom and compassion as a leader. He understood that families needed their fathers and that farms needed their workers. By organizing the labor in shifts, he made sure the temple got built without destroying the lives of his people. Adoram was put in charge of this enormous workforce, making sure the rotation system worked smoothly and that the work in Lebanon continued without interruption. But the Lebanese workers were just part of the massive project. Solomon also had 70,000 men who carried burdens, and 80,000 who were stonecutters in the mountains of Israel. These weren't foreigners. These were people from the nations that had lived in the land before Israel, and now they were contributing their skills to build God's house. 1 Kings chapter 5 tells us that besides the chief officers, Solomon had 3,300 who ruled over the people who labored in the work. The organization required to coordinate all these workers was incredible. Think about it, over 180,000 people working on a single project, with materials coming from Lebanon, stones being cut in the mountains, and everything having to arrive in Jerusalem at exactly the right time. This wasn't just construction. This was like organizing a small army, except instead of fighting a war, they were building something beautiful for God. The stonework alone was a marvel of planning and skill. As 1 Kings chapter 6 records, and the temple, when it was being built, was built with stone, finished at the quarry, so that no hammer or chisel or any iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built. Every stone was cut and shaped perfectly at the quarry, then brought to Jerusalem and fitted into place without any noise or disturbance. The temple site itself remained peaceful and reverent even during the massive construction project. The temple Solomon built followed the exact specifications God had given to David, but on a scale that took everyone's breath away. As described in 1 Kings chapter 6, the temple was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high, roughly 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. These weren't just random measurements. Every dimension had been specified by God himself and carried deep spiritual meaning. The materials Solomon used were the finest available anywhere in the ancient world. The walls were covered with cedar wood carved with gourds and open flowers, and then overlaid with pure gold. 1 Kings chapter 6 tells us that the whole temple he overlaid with gold until he had finished all the temple. Also, he overlaid with gold the entire altar that was by the inner sanctuary. The amount of gold used was so enormous that it's hard to imagine. The entire interior of the temple gleamed like the sun in the inner sanctuary called the most holy place. Solomon placed 2 cherubim made of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. These weren't small decorations. They were massive sculptures with wings that stretched from wall to wall. As the Bible describes, one wing of the cherub was 5 cubits, and the other wing of the cherub 5 cubits, 10 cubits from the tip of one wing to the tip of the other. These golden cherubim stood guard over the place where God's presence would dwell. The temple's entrance was flanked by 2 bronze pillars that became famous throughout the ancient world. As 1 Kings chapter 7 records, Solomon made these pillars 18 cubits high each, with capitals that were 5 cubits high, decorated with network and chainwork, with pomegranates carved all around. He called the right pillar Jachin and the left pillar Boaz, names that meant he establishes and in him is strength. These pillars weren't just decorative, they were declarations that God was the foundation and strength of Israel. But the temple was more than just beautiful architecture. Every detail had meaning. The carved pomegranates represented fruitfulness and blessing. The palm trees carved on the walls symbolized victory and eternal life. The open flowers spoke of beauty and the glory of God's creation. Walking into this temple wasn't just entering a building. It was stepping into a physical representation of heaven itself. After 7 years of construction, the moment finally came when God's house was complete and ready for its most sacred occupant. The Ark of the Covenant, which had been kept in a tent since the days of Moses, would finally have a permanent home. As 1 Kings chapter 8 describes, Solomon called together all the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes, and the chief fathers of the children of Israel to bring up the ark from the city of David. The procession that brought the ark to the temple was unlike anything Israel had ever seen. King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who had assembled with him were before the ark, sacrificing sheep and oxen that could not be told or numbered for multitude. This wasn't just a ceremony, it was a celebration that involved the entire nation. Every important person in Israel was there to witness this historic moment when God would finally dwell among his people in the house that bore his name. The priests carried the ark into the inner sanctuary of the temple, into the most holy place under the wings of the cherubim. As 1 Kings chapter 8 records, there was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone, which Moses put there at Horeb, when the Lord made a covenant with the children of Israel. When they came out of the land of Egypt, these tablets contained the 10 Commandments, God's own words written by his finger, and now they rested in the most sacred place on earth. When the priests came out of the holy place, something amazing happened. The Bible tells us that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not continue ministering because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. God himself had come to live in the temple Solomon had built. The presence that had led Israel through the wilderness, that had spoken from Mount Sinai, that had dwelt above the mercy seat, that same glorious presence now filled every corner of the magnificent temple. Solomon stood before the altar in the sight of all Israel, spread out his hands toward heaven, and began one of the most beautiful prayers ever recorded. As 1 Kings chapter 8 preserves his words, Lord God of Israel, there is no God in heaven above or on earth below like you, who keep your covenant and mercy with your servants who walk before you with all their hearts." Solomon's prayer acknowledged that even this magnificent temple couldn't contain the infinite God. Yet he asked that God would hear the prayers of his people when they prayed toward this place. After Solomon finished his prayer and the dedication ceremonies ended, God responded in a way that confirmed everything Solomon had hoped for. As recorded in 1 Kings chapter 9, the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time, just as he had appeared to him at Gibeon years earlier. This wasn't a dream this time. This was a direct encounter between the king and the creator of the universe. God's message was both encouraging and sobering. "I have heard your prayer and your supplication that you have made before me," the Lord said. "I have consecrated this house which you have built to put my name there forever, and my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually." This was exactly what Solomon had prayed for, God's promise that his presence would remain in the temple and that he would hear the prayers of his people when they turned toward this sacred place. But God's second appearance also came with serious conditions. The Lord made it clear that his blessings depended on continued obedience. "Now, if you walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and in uprightness, to do according to all that I have commanded you, and if you keep my statutes and my judgments, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever. As I promised David your father." The warning that followed was stark and unmistakable. "But if you or your sons at all turn from following me, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes which I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and this house which I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight." God was making it clear that even this magnificent temple, even his promised presence, could be removed if Israel turned away from him. This second divine appearance established a covenant that would govern Israel's relationship with God for centuries to come. The temple wasn't just a beautiful building. It was the physical center of a spiritual agreement between God and his chosen people. As long as they remained faithful, God would bless them beyond measure. But if they broke the covenant by worshiping other gods, even this glorious temple would become a ruin. Word of Solomon's incredible wisdom and the magnificence of his kingdom began to spread to the farthest corners of the known world. Kings and rulers heard amazing stories about this young king of Israel who possessed supernatural knowledge and had built a temple so beautiful that visitors were left speechless. But one ruler decided she had to see for herself whether these reports could possibly be true. The Queen of Sheba ruled a wealthy kingdom far to the south, probably in what is now Ethiopia or Yemen. She was powerful, intelligent, and used to dealing with the greatest rulers of her time. But the stories she heard about Solomon were so extraordinary that she couldn't ignore them. As 1 Kings chapter 10 records, when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. The Queen of Sheba's journey to Jerusalem wasn't a simple diplomatic visit. It was a serious investigation. She brought with her the hardest questions she could think of, the kind of puzzles that would stump even the wisest scholars in her own kingdom. She wanted to know if this Hebrew king really was as brilliant as people claimed, or if the stories had been exaggerated by enthusiastic admirers. When the queen arrived in Jerusalem with her enormous caravan, Solomon received her with all the honor due to a visiting monarch. She came with a very great retinue with camels that bore spices, very much gold, and precious stones. This wasn't just a courtesy visit. She brought gifts that demonstrated the wealth and power of her own kingdom, showing that she came as an equal, not as someone seeking favors. The Bible tells us that Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing so difficult for the king that he could not explain it to her. Every puzzle she presented, every complex problem she posed, every challenging question she asked, Solomon had answers that amazed and satisfied her brilliant mind. This wasn't just showing off. This was the demonstration of wisdom that could only come from God himself. But the Queen of Sheba was impressed by more than just Solomon's answers to her questions. 1 Kings chapter 10 describes her amazement at everything she saw. When the Queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers, and his entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. The Queen of Sheba's reaction to Solomon's court reveals just how magnificent his kingdom had become. She told the king honestly, "It was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. However, I did not believe the words until I came and saw with my own eyes. And indeed the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame of which I heard." The daily operations of Solomon's court were on a scale that seemed almost impossible to believe. As 1 Kings chapter 4 records, Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cors of fine flour, 60 cors of meal, 10 fatted oxen, 20 oxen from the pastures, and 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. This wasn't just feeding the royal family. This was providing meals for thousands of officials, servants, guards, and visitors who came to Jerusalem every single day. The throne Solomon sat on became legendary throughout the ancient world. As described in 1 Kings chapter 10, it was made of ivory and overlaid with the finest gold. The throne had 6 steps, and the top of the throne was round at the back. There were armrests on either side of the place of the seat, and 2 lions stood beside the armrests. 12 lions stood there, one on each side of the 6 steps. Nothing like this had been made for any other kingdom. These 12 lions weren't just decorations. They represented the 12 tribes of Israel, showing that Solomon ruled over all of God's people. Every time the king climbed the steps to his throne, he passed between these symbols of the nation he governed. Foreign visitors understood immediately that they were in the presence of a ruler whose power and authority were unlike anything they had ever encountered. The wealth that flowed through Solomon's kingdom was so enormous that silver became as common as stones in Jerusalem. 1 Kings chapter 10 tells us that the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and he made cedars as abundant as the sycamores, which are in the lowland. This wasn't just royal wealth concentrated in the palace. This was prosperity that reached throughout the entire kingdom. Solomon's fleet of ships brought treasures from distant lands that most people had never even heard of. For the king had merchant ships at sea with the fleet of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the merchant ships came bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and monkeys. These exotic imports showed that Solomon's influence reached to the ends of the earth, and that even the most distant kingdoms wanted to trade with Israel. The reputation of Solomon's kingdom became so great that rulers from every nation sent ambassadors with gifts and tribute. So King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom, the Bible records. Now all the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. Each man brought his present, articles of silver and gold, garments, armor, spices, horses, and mules. At a set rate year by year, Jerusalem had become the center of the ancient world, the place where kings and scholars came to learn, where merchants came to trade, and where anyone seeking wisdom came to sit at the feet of the wisest man who had ever lived. Solomon understood something that would change the ancient world forever, that marriages could be more powerful than armies when it came to securing lasting peace. In the ancient Near East, kings had been using marriage alliances for centuries as a way to prevent wars and create stable relationships between kingdoms. When 2 royal families were connected by marriage, it became much harder for their nations to attack each other, because now they were family. The young king of Israel looked at the map of his kingdom and saw enemies on every border. To the south lay Egypt, the most powerful nation in the world. To the east were Moab, Ammon, and Edom. kingdoms that had fought Israel for generations. To the north were the Hittites and other powerful peoples. Instead of building massive armies to fight all these potential enemies, Solomon chose a different path. He would turn enemies into family through carefully planned marriages. This wasn't just about Solomon's personal desires. This was brilliant political strategy. Every marriage Solomon made was calculated to bring specific benefits to Israel. Some marriages would secure trade routes, others would prevent invasions, and still others would bring new knowledge and skills to his kingdom. Solomon approached marriage the way a master chess player approaches the game, thinking several moves ahead and understanding how each decision would affect the entire board. The wisdom behind Solomon's marriage diplomacy was that it created a web of relationships that made war almost impossible. If the king of Moab wanted to attack Israel, he would have to consider that Solomon was married to a Moabite princess, his own relative. If Egypt considered moving against Israel's southern border, Pharaoh would remember that his own daughter lived in Jerusalem as Solomon's wife. Each marriage created a new reason for peace and a new obstacle to war. But Solomon's marriage strategy went beyond just preventing conflicts. These alliances opened up possibilities for trade, cultural exchange, and mutual cooperation that had never existed before. When you marry into a royal family, you don't just get a wife. You get access to that kingdom's markets, their craftsmen's skills, their trade routes, and their knowledge. Solomon was building not just peace, but prosperity for his people through these carefully chosen relationships. Solomon's most important early marriage was also the most shocking to the ancient world. As 1 Kings chapter 3 records, Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. This wasn't just unusual, it was almost unthinkable. Egypt was the greatest superpower of the ancient world, and their pharaohs considered themselves to be gods. Egyptian princesses simply did not marry foreign kings. The fact that Pharaoh was willing to give his daughter to Solomon showed just how much respect Israel had gained under its wise young king. Egypt, which had once enslaved the Israelites and chased them into the wilderness, now wanted to be Solomon's ally so badly that they were willing to break their own ancient customs. This marriage alliance meant that the two most powerful kingdoms in the region were now family instead of potential enemies. Solomon didn't just marry the Egyptian princess and ignore her background. He honored her royal status by building her a special palace separate from his other residences. As 1 Kings chapter 7 mentions, Solomon built a house for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken as wife. Like this hall, this showed respect for Egypt and demonstrated that Solomon understood the importance of treating his royal wife with the dignity her position deserved. The marriage to Pharaoh's daughter brought immediate benefits to Israel. Trade between the two kingdoms flourished as merchants could now travel safely between Egypt and Israel, knowing that the royal families were connected. Egyptian knowledge of medicine, mathematics, and architecture began to flow into Israel, making Solomon's court even more sophisticated and advanced. This alliance also meant that Israel's southern border was completely secure. No longer did Solomon need to worry about Egyptian armies marching north to invade his territory. Instead of spending enormous amounts of money on fortifications and soldiers to guard against Egypt, Solomon could focus his resources on building projects, trade, and making his people more prosperous. The marriage had achieved through diplomacy what might have required decades of expensive military preparation to accomplish through force. But the Egyptian marriage also began to introduce foreign customs into Solomon's court. As his wife continued to worship the gods of Egypt, Solomon found ways to accommodate her religious practices while still honoring the Lord. This seemed like simple courtesy at the time, but it was the beginning of a pattern that would eventually reshape the spiritual atmosphere of the entire kingdom. Solomon's marriage strategy extended to Israel's immediate neighbors, kingdoms that had been enemies since the time of Moses and Joshua. The Moabites, Ammonites, and Edomites were peoples who shared ancestry with Israel through Abraham's family, but they had fought against God's chosen people for centuries. Now Solomon saw an opportunity to turn these ancient enemies into allies through marriage. Connections. These weren't just random diplomatic marriages. They were carefully planned. Alliances that addressed specific problems Israel had faced for generations. The Moabites controlled important trade routes to the east, and their hostility had made commerce difficult and dangerous. The Ammonites had a long history of raiding Israelite territory, creating constant tension on the eastern border. The Edomites controlled access to the Red Sea and the valuable copper mines in their territory. When Solomon married princesses from these kingdoms, everything changed. Suddenly, the trade routes through Moab became safe for Israelite merchants. The Ammonite raids stopped because their king's daughter was now living in Jerusalem as Solomon's wife. The Edomites, instead of blocking Israel's access to sea trade, became partners who helped Solomon's ships reach distant markets. The economic benefits of these marriages were enormous. Copper from Edom helped fund Solomon's building projects and added to Israel's wealth. Trade routes that had been closed or dangerous for generations now became highways of prosperity. Merchants could travel from Damascus to the Red Sea without fear of attack. And Israel collected taxes and fees from all the trade that passed through their territory. But these marriages did more than just secure trade routes. They fundamentally changed the political landscape of the region. Nations that had seen Israel as an enemy now had family connections to the Israelite royal house. When disputes arose, instead of reaching for swords, these kingdoms could send ambassadors who were related to Solomon's wives. Family connections provided channels for negotiation and compromise that had never existed before. The transformation was remarkable. Within just a few years, Israel's eastern borders went from being zones of constant conflict to areas of peaceful cooperation. Villages that had lived in fear of raids could now focus on farming and commerce. Young men who might have spent their lives as soldiers could instead become merchants, craftsmen, or scholars. The marriages had literally changed the daily lives of thousands of ordinary people who no longer had to worry about war. Solomon's marriage diplomacy wasn't limited to neighboring kingdoms. He also reached out to more distant peoples whose skills and knowledge could benefit Israel. The Sidonians were master sailors and traders whose ships traveled to the farthest corners of the Mediterranean Sea. The Hittites were skilled in metalworking and had knowledge of advanced military technology. Marriages with these peoples brought new capabilities to Solomon's kingdom. As 1 Kings chapter 11 records, King Solomon loved many foreign women, and among them were Sidonians and Hittites. These weren't just romantic attachments. They were strategic alliances that gave Israel access to maritime expertise and advanced craftsmanship that the landlocked kingdom had never possessed before. The Sidonian connection was particularly valuable because it gave Solomon's kingdom access to the Mediterranean trade networks. Sidonian wives brought with them knowledge of navigation, shipbuilding, and the complex web of trading relationships that connected distant ports across the sea. This knowledge helped Solomon develop his own merchant fleet and expand Israel's commercial reach far beyond what had ever been possible before. The Hittite marriages brought different but equally important benefits. The Hittites had been a major power in the ancient world and possessed advanced knowledge of metallurgy, warfare, and government administration. Hittite wives in Solomon's court brought with them craftsmen, advisors, and scholars who contributed to the growing sophistication of Israel's civilization. These northern and western marriages also began to change the cultural atmosphere of Solomon's court in Jerusalem. Instead of being purely Israelite in its customs and practices, the royal palace became a cosmopolitan center where different traditions mixed and blended. Courtiers could hear multiple languages spoken in the palace corridors, see art from different cultures decorating the walls, and taste foods from distant lands. at royal feasts. The influence of these foreign wives extended beyond the palace walls to affect the broader culture of Israel. New styles of clothing, architecture, and decoration began to appear throughout the kingdom. Musical instruments from other cultures were introduced, creating new sounds in Israelite music. Even the language began to change as new words from other cultures entered Hebrew vocabulary. This cultural blending created an atmosphere that attracted visitors from around the world. Scholars, artists, and merchants came to Jerusalem not just to see Solomon's wisdom and wealth, but to experience the unique international culture that was developing there. The kingdom was becoming a bridge between different civilizations, a place where East met West and North met South in peaceful exchange. As Solomon's marriage alliances multiplied, his household grew into something unprecedented in Israel's history. 1 Kings chapter 11 gives us the staggering numbers. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. This wasn't just about personal relationships. This was a massive political and economic institution that required careful organization and enormous resources to maintain. The structure of Solomon's household followed patterns established by other great empires of the ancient world, but on a scale that surpassed them all. Each wife wasn't just a person, she was a representative of her home kingdom, a living symbol of the alliance between Israel and her people. The most important wives, the actual princesses, held higher status and had their own courts within the larger royal household. The organization required to manage such a vast household was incredibly complex. Each wife needed her own living quarters, her own servants, and her own allowance for food, clothing, and personal expenses. Multiply this by hundreds of women, and you begin to understand the massive undertaking Solomon had created. The royal household had become like a small city within Jerusalem, with its own economy, its own social structure, and its own political dynamics. The political implications of maintaining such a large harem extended far beyond Israel's borders. Every kingdom that had given a princess to Solomon now had a personal interest in Israel's prosperity and security. If anything happened to Solomon or his kingdom, their own daughters and sisters would suffer. This created a network of international stakeholders who had personal reasons to want Israel to succeed and remain stable. The prestige that came from Solomon's extensive household was enormous. In the ancient world, the size of a king's household was a direct measure of his power and importance. Kings with small households were considered weak or unimportant, while those with vast households were seen as major powers who demanded respect and careful treatment. Solomon's household announced to the world that Israel was now a superpower that couldn't be ignored, but maintaining this massive household required incredible wealth. The daily expenses of feeding, clothing, and caring for over 1,000 women, plus all their servants and attendants, was staggering. Add to this the cost of the palaces, gardens, and facilities needed to house everyone comfortably, and the royal household became one of the largest expenses in the entire kingdom's budget. The household also created new opportunities for cultural and intellectual exchange, with women from dozens of different kingdoms living together in Jerusalem. Languages, customs, and ideas mixed in ways that had never happened before. Children born in this environment grew up truly cosmopolitan, familiar with multiple cultures and comfortable in international settings. The international character of Solomon's court created an unprecedented opportunity for cultural exchange and artistic innovation. With wives from Egypt, Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and dozens of other places, the royal palace became a meeting place where different artistic traditions encountered each other and created something entirely new. The influence of foreign wives could be seen in every aspect of palace life. Egyptian wives brought knowledge of their homeland's sophisticated art and architecture, contributing to the design of new buildings and the decoration of existing ones. Mesopotamian wives introduced different styles of music and poetry that blended with traditional Israelite forms to create new artistic expressions. The palace gardens became a particular showcase for this international influence. Plants and trees from distant lands were brought to Jerusalem and cultivated in special gardens that reflected the diverse origins of Solomon's wives. Visitors to the palace could walk through areas that reminded them of the Nile Delta, the mountains of Lebanon, or the hills of Moab, all within the walls of Jerusalem. The fusion of different artistic traditions extended to the crafts and industries that supported the royal household. Textiles began to incorporate patterns and techniques from multiple cultures. Jewelry combined styles from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean coast. Even everyday items like furniture and cookware showed influences from the many cultures represented in Solomon's court. This artistic blending created a distinctive style that became known throughout the ancient world as uniquely Solomon's. Visitors to Jerusalem could immediately recognize the international sophistication of the court, and many tried to copy elements of what they saw when they returned to their own kingdoms. The cultural exchange wasn't limited to material things. It included ideas, stories, and knowledge from different civilizations. Solomon's court became like a great library where the wisdom of many peoples was collected and preserved. Scholars could study not just Israelite traditions, but the accumulated knowledge of dozens of cultures, all brought together in one place. Musicians and entertainers from different kingdoms brought their own instruments and performance styles, creating concerts and celebrations that featured sounds never heard before in Israel. Cooks from various cultures introduced new foods and cooking techniques that expanded the palace menu far beyond traditional Israelite cuisine. This cosmopolitan atmosphere made Jerusalem a destination for anyone interested in experiencing the best of multiple civilizations. The court became famous not just for Solomon's wisdom and wealth, but for the unique cultural environment that existed nowhere else in the ancient world. As more and more foreign wives joined Solomon's household, the king faced a delicate challenge: how to accommodate their religious practices while maintaining his own devotion to the Lord. Initially, Solomon tried to balance these competing demands through what seemed like reasonable compromise and diplomatic courtesy. The foreign wives hadn't abandoned their ancestral gods when they married Solomon. Egyptian princesses still wanted to worship the deities of the Nile. Moabite women continued their devotion to Chemosh. Sidonian wives maintained their allegiance to their traditional gods. At first, Solomon saw no harm in allowing these private religious observances, thinking it was simply showing respect for his wives' backgrounds and maintaining good relationships with their home kingdoms. Solomon began making accommodations that seemed minor at the time, but would prove to have major consequences. He allowed his wives to maintain shrines and small altars where they could offer prayers and small sacrifices to their gods. These weren't public ceremonies that challenged Israel's official worship of the Lord. They were private family observances that took place within the royal household. The king even provided spaces within the palace complex where his wives could worship according to their own traditions. Different sections of the royal grounds were designated for different religious practices, allowing the diverse household to maintain their various spiritual observances without conflict or interference. As time passed, Solomon found himself occasionally participating in these foreign religious activities, not out of personal conviction, but as a gesture of respect for his wives and their families. When important religious festivals from other cultures occurred, Solomon would sometimes make appearances or offer ceremonial participation to show honor to the kingdoms he was allied with. Through marriage, the gradual shift in the religious atmosphere of the court was subtle but real. What had once been exclusively focused on the worship of the Lord began to include acknowledgement of other deities as well. The palace, which had originally reflected only Israelite religious values, slowly became a place where multiple religious traditions coexisted. This religious accommodation seemed like wise diplomacy to Solomon and his advisors. It kept peace within the royal household, maintained good relationships with allied kingdoms, and avoided religious conflicts that might threaten the political alliances the marriages had created. The king convinced himself that his personal devotion to the Lord remained unchanged, even as he made room for other religious expressions. The changes were gradual enough that they didn't seem alarming to most observers. Solomon still participated in the major festivals at the temple, still offered the required sacrifices, and still maintained the appearance of orthodox worship of the Lord. But the foundation was being laid for much more dramatic religious changes that would come later in his reign. While Solomon focused on the diplomatic and cultural benefits of his extensive marriage alliances, problems were beginning to develop that would eventually threaten the very kingdom he was trying to strengthen. The enormous cost of maintaining such a vast royal household was putting increasing financial pressure on the people of Israel, and some were starting to question whether the benefits were worth the price. The expenses associated with Solomon's marriages went far beyond just caring for his wives and concubines. Each alliance required ongoing diplomatic gifts, ceremonial expenses, and the maintenance of relationships that cost money year after year. The palace complex had to be constantly expanded to accommodate new wives and their retinues. The royal budget was stretched to levels that would have been unthinkable during David's reign. To pay for these expenses, Solomon had to increase taxes throughout the kingdom and expand the forced labor requirements that took men away from their own farms and businesses. The 12 administrative districts that had once seemed like an efficient way to organize the kingdom were now primarily mechanisms for extracting resources to support the royal lifestyle. People who had enjoyed prosperity during the early years of Solomon's reign found themselves working harder for less benefit. The religious accommodations that had seemed like simple courtesy were also beginning to create tension within Israel. Some of the people noticed that the palace was no longer exclusively devoted to the worship of the Lord, and they worried about what this might mean for the spiritual health of the kingdom. Traditional priests and prophets watched with growing concern as foreign religious practices gained acceptance in the very center of Israel's government. The international character of the court, which had once seemed exciting and sophisticated, was starting to feel foreign to many Israelites. When they visited Jerusalem, they found a royal court that looked and sounded more like the capitals of surrounding nations than like the Israel they remembered. The king seemed to be becoming more like the pagan rulers around him and less like the shepherd King David had been. The burden of supporting Solomon's household fell most heavily on the northern tribes, who provided much of the forced labor and paid many of the taxes. These were the same tribes that had sometimes chafed under southern rule in the past. And the growing financial pressure was reviving old regional tensions that David's leadership had smoothed over. Young men who might have expected to inherit their father's farms found themselves conscripted for months at a time to work on royal building projects. Families struggled to pay the increasing taxes while their primary breadwinners were away fulfilling labor obligations. The prosperity that had blessed Israel during the early years of Solomon's reign was becoming more and more concentrated in Jerusalem, while the countryside struggled under increasing burdens. The very success of Solomon's marriage diplomacy was creating internal problems that threatened to tear apart the kingdom it was supposed to protect. The web of international relationships had grown so complex and expensive that maintaining it was consuming resources faster than the kingdom could generate them. The seeds of division were being planted even as Solomon reached the height of his power and prestige. As Solomon grew older, the accommodation he had made for his foreign wives began to transform into something far more dangerous. What had started as simple diplomatic courtesy gradually became personal participation in the worship of foreign gods. The king, who had once prayed so beautifully at the temple's dedication, was now dividing his heart between the Lord and the deities his wives served. The change didn't happen overnight. It began with small compromises that seemed reasonable at the time. Solomon would attend ceremonies honoring his wives' gods, not out of belief, but out of what he told himself was political necessity. He would offer token participation in foreign festivals, convincing himself that he was just maintaining important diplomatic relationships. But each compromise made the next one easier, and slowly Solomon's heart began to turn away from exclusive devotion to the Lord. As 1 Kings chapter 11 records the tragic transformation. For it was so, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father. David, the wisest man in the world, was making the most foolish mistake possible, abandoning the source of his wisdom and strength. The spiritual decline accelerated as Solomon began to build actual places of worship for his wives' gods. These weren't just private shrines anymore. They were public high places where sacrifices could be offered to foreign deities. On the Mount of Olives, directly across from the temple where God's presence dwelt, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the god of Moab, and for Molech, the god of the Ammonites. The irony was heartbreaking. The king who had built the most magnificent temple in the world for the true God was now building competing temples for false gods. The man who had been blessed with supernatural wisdom was now acting with spiritual foolishness that would have consequences lasting for centuries. Solomon had become exactly what God had warned Israel's kings never to become, a ruler whose heart had been turned away by his many wives. The Bible makes it clear that this wasn't just a political mistake. It was spiritual adultery of the worst kind. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. 1 Kings chapter 11 continues. Solomon wasn't just tolerating idol worship, he was actively facilitating and participating in it. The king who should have been leading Israel in pure worship of the Lord was instead leading them into the very idolatry that God had forbidden. God's patience with Solomon's spiritual rebellion finally reached its limit. The Lord, who had appeared to Solomon twice before, who had blessed him with wisdom beyond measure, who had made him the richest and most powerful king on earth, now came with a message of judgment. As 1 Kings chapter 11 records, the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. The divine anger wasn't sudden or unexpected. It was the inevitable result of Solomon's continued disobedience despite clear warnings. God had specifically commanded him about this very danger when he appeared the second time after the temple's dedication. The Lord had warned that if Solomon or his descendants turned away to serve other gods, there would be severe consequences. Now that warning was becoming reality. God's message to Solomon was devastating. Because you have done this, and have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. The kingdom that David had built and Solomon had expanded was going to be ripped apart because of the king's spiritual unfaithfulness. But even in his anger, God showed mercy that reflected his love for David and his promises to Israel. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days, for the sake of your father David, the Lord declared. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. The judgment would come, but it would be delayed out of respect for David's faithfulness and to give Solomon's family one more chance to turn back to God. God's mercy extended even further in his promise to preserve part of the kingdom. However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. Even in judgment, God was keeping his covenant promises and ensuring that the line of David would continue to rule in Jerusalem. This divine warning should have been a wake-up call that brought Solomon to his knees in repentance. The God who had blessed him beyond measure was now warning him of coming disaster. The kingdom that had reached the height of its power and glory was about to be torn apart. Any wise king would have immediately abandoned the idol worship, torn down the high places, and returned to exclusive devotion to the Lord. But Solomon's heart had become so hardened by years of compromise that even this direct warning from God didn't turn him back to obedience. The king, who had once been famous for his wisdom, was now demonstrating spiritual foolishness that defied understanding. He continued in the very behavior that God had warned would destroy his kingdom. As Solomon's spiritual condition deteriorated, political opposition began to emerge from within his own kingdom. The most significant threat came from an unlikely source, one of Solomon's own officials named Jeroboam. As 1 Kings chapter 11 tells us, Jeroboam was the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite from Zeridah, Solomon's servant, whose mother's name was Zeruiah. A widow, he was a man of valor whom Solomon had put in charge of all the forced labor. From the tribes of Joseph, Jeroboam's position gave him direct contact with the people who were bearing the heaviest burden of Solomon's expensive lifestyle, the workers, who were forced to leave their homes and families for months at a time to build the king's projects. He saw firsthand the growing resentment among the northern tribes, who felt they were being treated more like slaves than citizens. The discontent was spreading, and people were starting to look for someone who might represent their interests against the king's demands. The turning point came when Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem and encountered the prophet Ahijah from Shiloh on the road. What happened next was one of the most dramatic prophetic acts in all of Scripture. As 1 Kings chapter 11 describes, Ahijah had clothed himself with a new garment, and the two were alone in the field. Then Ahijah took hold of the new garment that was on him and tore it into 12 pieces. The prophet's actions carried a message that would shake the kingdom to its foundations. "Take for yourself 10 pieces, Ahijah told Jeroboam, "for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and will give 10 tribes to you." This wasn't just political revolution. This was divine judgment being announced through God's chosen prophet. Ahijah's prophecy explained exactly why this judgment was coming. "Because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Milcom, the god of the people of Ammon, and have not walked in my ways to do what is right in my eyes and keep my statutes and my judgments, as did his father David." But the prophet also made it clear that this division wasn't going to happen immediately. "However, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, because I have made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of my servant David, whom I chose because he kept my commandments and my statutes," Ahijah continued. The judgment would fall on Solomon's son, not on Solomon himself. When word of this prophetic encounter reached Solomon, the king's response revealed how far he had fallen from the wisdom of his earlier years. Instead of repenting and seeking God's forgiveness, Solomon tried to solve a spiritual problem with political violence. As 1 Kings chapter 11 records, Solomon therefore sought to kill Jeroboam. But Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon, while Solomon dealt with Jeroboam's rebellion through attempted assassination. The underlying problems that had caused the opposition were getting worse every year. The magnificent lifestyle that had made Solomon famous throughout the world was being paid for by increasingly heavy taxation and forced labor that was crushing the common people of Israel. The economic burden had grown far beyond what the kingdom could reasonably bear. The daily food requirements for Solomon's court, as recorded earlier in his reign, were staggering enough. But now, with hundreds of wives and concubines, thousands of servants, and constant building projects, the expenses had multiplied beyond all reason. The 12 administrative districts were no longer just providing for the kingdom's needs, they were being drained too. support royal luxury on an unprecedented scale. The forced labor system had become particularly oppressive to the northern tribes. Young men who should have been home helping with harvests, caring for their families, or building their own businesses were instead conscripted to work on royal projects that benefited only the king and his court. Families struggled to survive when their primary breadwinners were away for months at a time, and communities suffered when their strongest workers were taken away. The taxation required to fund Solomon's lifestyle had reached levels that would have been unthinkable during David's reign. Farmers had to give up larger and larger portions of their harvests to pay the king's taxes. Merchants found their profits eaten up by royal levies. Craftsmen discovered that much of their work was being claimed by the government to support the royal household. His endless appetite for luxury goods, the contrast between the royal court's extravagance and the people's struggles was becoming impossible to ignore. While Solomon and his wives lived in palaces decorated with gold and fed on the finest foods from around the world, ordinary Israelites were finding it harder and harder to provide basic necessities for their families. The prosperity that had once blessed the entire kingdom was now concentrated almost entirely in Jerusalem, while the countryside groaned under increasing burdens. The traditional freedoms that had defined Israel since the time of Moses were being eroded by the demands of maintaining Solomon's imperial lifestyle. The people who had once been delivered from slavery in Egypt were now experiencing a different kind of bondage, economic slavery to support their own king's excesses. The forced labor gangs, the crushing taxation, and the arbitrary seizure of property for royal projects all violated the principles of freedom and justice that were supposed to govern God's chosen people. Regional resentment was particularly strong among the northern tribes, who provided much of the labor and paid many of the taxes, but received fewer benefits than the southern tribes closer to Jerusalem. The tribal leaders who had once been proud to serve under David's righteous rule were now questioning whether the current arrangement was fair or sustainable. Solomon's internal problems were made worse by the emergence of external enemies who sensed weakness in the once mighty kingdom. The network of alliances and tributaries that had kept Israel's borders secure during the early years of Solomon's reign began to unravel as local leaders saw opportunities to break free from Israelite control. The first major challenge came from an unexpected source. As 1 Kings chapter 11 records, "Now the Lord raised up an adversary against Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. He was a descendant of the king in Edom." This Hadad had escaped to Egypt as a child when David conquered Edom years earlier, and Pharaoh had given him refuge, even marrying him to his sister-in-law. When Hadad heard that both David and Joab were dead, he asked Pharaoh to let him return to his homeland. Despite Pharaoh's attempts to convince him to stay in Egypt, where he was living comfortably, Hadad was determined to go back to Edom and challenge Israelite rule there. His return created a focal point for Edomite resistance that gradually grew into open rebellion. The loss of Edomite territory was a serious blow to Solomon's kingdom. Edom controlled important trade routes to the south and east, including access to the port of Etzion-Geber on the Red Sea, where Solomon's merchant fleet operated. The copper mines that had contributed to Israel's wealth were also located in Edomite territory. Hadad's successful rebellion cut off these vital resources and reduced both Solomon's income and his strategic options. But Hadad wasn't the only external enemy troubling Solomon's later years. God also raised up another adversary, Rezon the son of Eliada, who had fled from his lord, Hadadezer king of Zobah. According to 1 Kings chapter 11, this Rezon had gathered men around him and become the leader of a band of raiders who eventually captured Damascus and established an independent kingdom there. Rezon's control of Damascus was particularly problematic because it threatened Israel's northern trade routes and provided a base for constant harassment of Israelite territory. The Bible records that He was an adversary of Israel all the days of Solomon. This meant that instead of enjoying the peace that had characterized the early years of his reign, Solomon's later years were marked by constant low-level warfare that drained resources and created anxiety throughout the kingdom. The emergence of these external enemies revealed how much Solomon's spiritual decline had weakened his kingdom. During his early years, when he was faithful to God, the Lord had given him rest on every side, but now that he had turned to idol worship, God was allowing enemies to arise who would trouble Israel and demonstrate the consequences of abandoning divine protection. The gradual erosion of the empire David had built and Solomon had expanded was a clear sign that God's blessing was being withdrawn from the kingdom. Territory that had been securely under Israelite control for decades was slipping away. Trade routes that had generated wealth for Israel were being disrupted or lost entirely. The military dominance that had made Israel the regional superpower was being challenged by smaller but more determined enemies. As Solomon's kingdom crumbled around him and his spiritual life fell into ruin, the king, who had once been famous for his joyful wisdom, began to write with a very different tone. The book of Ecclesiastes, traditionally attributed to Solomon in his later years, reveals a man grappling with the emptiness and meaninglessness of a life lived apart from God's purposes. The opening words of Ecclesiastes chapter 1 set the tone for the entire book. "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher, "vanity of vanities. All is vanity." This wasn't the confident wisdom of Solomon's earlier years. This was the bitter reflection of a man who had achieved everything the world could offer, but found it all ultimately empty and unsatisfying. Solomon's later writings revealed a deep philosophical struggle between the knowledge he had accumulated and the spiritual fulfillment that had eluded him. "I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem," he wrote in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. "And I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. This burdensome task God has given to the sons of man, by which they may be exercised." The king's pursuit of meaning through human achievement and pleasure had led only to deeper despair. "I said in my heart, 'Come now, I will test you with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure.' But surely this also was vanity," Solomon reflected in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. He had tried everything: building projects, gardens, servants, wealth, entertainment, but none of it brought lasting satisfaction. Solomon's honest assessment of his accomplishments was devastating. "Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled. And indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. The man who had built the temple, created a vast kingdom, and accumulated wisdom beyond measure, now saw it all as meaningless activity that brought no real benefit." The writings reveal Solomon's growing understanding that wisdom without obedience to God leads nowhere worthwhile. "For in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow," he observed in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. The very gift that had made him famous had become a source of pain when separated from its divine source. Yet, even in his despair, glimpses of Solomon's earlier wisdom occasionally broke through. "Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all," he concluded in Ecclesiastes chapter 12. "For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil." Even in his fallen state, Solomon still recognized that the fear of the Lord was the beginning of wisdom. The contrast between Solomon's earlier proverbs, full of practical wisdom and confidence in God's ways, and his later reflections in Ecclesiastes, marked by despair and emptiness, showed clearly what happened when someone turned away from the source of true wisdom. The wisest man in the world had become living proof that knowledge without obedience to God leads only to meaninglessness. After 40 years of ruling Israel, Solomon died and was buried in the city of David, as 1 Kings chapter 11 records. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon, all that he did and his wisdom, Are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? And the period that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. The great king's reign had come to an end. But the consequences of his choices were just beginning to unfold. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, immediately succeeded to the throne. But his kingdom was far different from the united, prosperous nation his grandfather David had left to Solomon. The internal tensions that had built up during Solomon's later years were ready to explode, and Rehoboam would face the crisis his father's policies had created. The northern tribes, led by the same Jeroboam who had fled to Egypt years earlier, approached the new king with what seemed like a reasonable request. As 1 Kings chapter 12 records, they came to Rehoboam at Shechem and said, "Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the burdensome service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you." This was the moment when wise leadership could have held the kingdom together. The people weren't asking for revolution. They were asking for relief from the crushing taxation and forced labor that had made their lives so difficult. They were willing to continue serving the Davidic dynasty if the new king would just reduce the economic burden that had grown so heavy under Solomon's rule. Rehoboam asked for 3 days to consider their request, which showed some wisdom in not making a hasty decision. During this time, he consulted 2 groups of advisors whose counsel would determine the future of Israel. First, he spoke with the elders who had served his father Solomon. Their advice was wise and practical. If you will be a servant to these people today, and serve them, and answer them, and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. But Rehoboam also consulted the young men who had grown up with him, and their advice was completely different. These younger advisors, who had known only the luxury of Solomon's court, told the king to respond harshly to the people's request. "Thus you should speak to this people who have spoken to you, saying, 'Your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us.' Thus you shall say to them, 'My little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist. And now, whereas my father put a heavy yoke on you, I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges.'" When the 3 days were up and Jeroboam and all the people returned for the king's answer, Rehoboam made a decision that would split Israel forever. He rejected the wise counsel of the elders and followed the foolish advice of his young friends. 1 Kings chapter 12 records his harsh response. "My father made your yoke heavy, and I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges." The reaction to Rehoboam's foolish decision was immediate and devastating. As soon as the northern tribes heard the new king's harsh words, they responded with words that would echo through history. "What share have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to your own house, O David." The kingdom that David had united and Solomon had expanded was splitting apart before everyone's eyes. 1 Kings chapter 12 records that when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, "What share have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to your own house, O David." So Israel departed to their tents. The break was immediate and decisive. 10 tribes walked away from Davidic rule and never returned. Jeroboam, who had been waiting in Egypt for this moment, returned to become king over the northern tribes. The prophecy that Ahijah had delivered years earlier was being fulfilled, exactly as God had predicted. The kingdom was being torn away from Solomon's family because of his spiritual unfaithfulness, and 10 tribes were being given to his former servant. Rehoboam was left ruling only over the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, plus the city of Jerusalem. When he attempted to use force to bring the northern tribes back under his control, God intervened through the prophet Shemaiah. As 1 Kings chapter 12 records, the word of the Lord came to Shemaiah, "Speak to Rehoboam the son of Solomon, king of Judah, to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, saying, 'Thus says the Lord, you shall not go up nor fight against your brethren the children of Israel. Let every man return to his house, for this thing is from me. The division of Israel was complete and permanent. What had once been a single mighty kingdom under David and Solomon was now two separate nations, Israel in the north under Jeroboam and Judah in the south under Rehoboam. The unity that had made Israel strong enough to dominate the ancient Near East was shattered, and both kingdoms would spend the rest of their histories struggling with enemies they could have easily defeated when they were united. The tragic irony was that this disaster could have been prevented at multiple points. If Solomon had remained faithful to God instead of turning to idol worship, the divine judgment would never have been pronounced. If he had listened to the prophet's warning and repented, God might have shown mercy. If Rehoboam had chosen wise counselors over foolish ones, the northern tribes might have remained loyal despite their grievances. Instead, Solomon's spiritual compromise had set in motion a chain of events that destroyed the very kingdom his wisdom and diplomatic skill had built to unprecedented heights. The man who had started his reign by asking God for wisdom to govern his people ended his dynasty by splitting that people into two hostile nations. The consequences of his choices would affect not just his immediate family, but generations of Israelites who would suffer from the weakness and division that replaced the strength and unity of David's kingdom. If this incredible biblical story opened your eyes to something new about Solomon's life, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest biblical stories. Share this video with someone who loves learning about the amazing people and events in Scripture. Trust me, they'll thank you for it. What part of Solomon's story surprised you the most? Drop a comment below and let's discuss this fascinating king together. And remember, there are so many more incredible biblical stories waiting to be told. So stick around because we're just getting started.